My name is James Wolfinger. I'm Associate Dean for Curriculum and Programs here at the College of Education at DePaul University. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to DePaul and the College of Education and this year's Spring Education Issues Forum entitled Advancing Democracy and Justice in Public Education in the Trump-DeVos Era. This is obviously an important and timely topic for all of us to consider, and I'm really proud that DePaul is able to offer the stage for this conversation today. We have an impressive array of guests, including Kevin Kumashiro, Brandon Johnson, Cheryl Flores, and Cassie Cresswell. And they'll be bringing us perspectives from higher education, from the K-12 classroom, and also from community organizations. So we're going to have a very interesting conversation, I think. Tonight's agenda, which is about advancing democracy, equity, and justice, is one that is near and dear to all of our hearts. And I look forward to a really robust dialogue about how we as a collective can achieve a common aim. So I first want to thank Diane Horowitz for organizing this forum. And in advance, I also want to thank our panelists for their thoughtful input into today's discussion. And I want to conclude by once again welcoming you to DePaul University and our College of Education. Please do enjoy this evening's forum. Thank you.
Kevin tonight is going to offer us an overview of the education policies coming from the U.S. Department of Education under DeVos, putting them in a historical and philosophical context, and offering some thoughts for us on how, as educators and citizens, we can build an education movement that advances equity and democracy. And after Kevin's talk, we have 3 local educators, activists, advocates, who will respond to our current moment by bringing it closer to home by looking at what's going on here in Chicago and in Illinois, and also hopefully offering us opportunities for how we all can get involved. So the first person is Cassie Cresswell, down there. Cassie is a volunteer with Raise Your Hand and the co-executive director of Raise Your Hand Action, their legislative advocacy sister organization. And I just want to mention we have lots, where did they go? Lots of handouts. What? They're gone? They're handouts. They're gone. Okay. Great. People are getting ready to do things. That's why they're gone. We'll make more. So I was going to say we have all these great handouts for Raise Your Hand. For those of you who don't know about it, it's a grassroots parent group whose mission is to preserve and support a high-quality public education, both here in Chicago and Illinois. And they work on a whole variety of issues, including equitable funding, privatization of the public school system, and that's what mostly they're going to focus on tonight, as well as other issues. Cassie has also been a leader in the More Than a Score coalition. I don't know if any of you have heard of More Than a Score, which has helped thousands of parents across Illinois refuse state testing for their children. She's also a volunteer member of the Illinois Coalition for EdTPA rule change, and for those of you who are about to student teach or have student teach, you know EdTPA is the exam required for licensure in Illinois, which has been widely criticized by educators. So Cassie has her hands in lots of different organizations. She also has a PhD in linguistics and a master's in computer science. And she's going to discuss tonight the current and potential events, serious possibilities of public school privatization in Illinois, specifically looking at the Raise Your Hand campaign, along with many other organizations against voucher initiatives, as well as an end to the state charter commission. Cheryl Flores there is the director of community schools and youth services at the Brighton Park Neighborhood Council. And Brighton Park Neighborhood Council is a community-based nonprofit on the southwest side of Chicago. They work on a variety of issues in addition to education, economic justice, immigrant rights, health care, violence programs, etc. Cheryl has worked in many different roles regarding civic engagement, youth development, and education. In her current role as the Director of Community Schools and Youth Services, she collaborates with Chicago Public School administrators, parents, and students to develop quality programming and opportunities for young people in Brighton Park. And this was her home at one point. Cheryl earned a Master's in Public Administration from DePaul. It's okay. And Cheryl is going to talk about Trump's immigration policies and specifically how they've impacted students and their families, teachers and students in the Brighton Park neighborhood, and the programs that the Neighborhood Council has developed to help teachers and students deal with the impact of these policies. So Brandon Johnson has served the public for over 20 years, fighting to improve the lives of families across Chicago. He's a former teacher, having taught middle school social studies and reading at Jenner Academy in Cabrini Green, and later social studies at Westinghouse High School. Brandon joined the organizing department of the Chicago Teachers Union in 2011 and currently serves as the Deputy Political Director, where he works with community members in organizations across Chicago, as well as teachers in the CTU, to demand progressive representation and research-based legislation at both the city and the state level. So you can catch Brandon on the radio, on 2 radio channels, so get out your pencils, write this down. He's the host of the new show, What's Left with Brandon Johnson, and it airs on WCPT Progressive Talk Radio 820 on your AM dial, 7 to 8 a.m. every day.
No, that's awful. Saturdays.
Saturday, and if you're still sleeping in, you can catch him at WVON 1690 at 11 to 12, which sounds more reasonable on Saturday. He resides on the west side of Chicago with his wife, Stacy, his 2 sons, and his daughter. And Brandon is going to be looking at organizing efforts around progressive taxation and equitable school funding, governance, specifically an elected school board for Chicago, and a stop to charter expansion. So let's give the panel.
Well, good evening, everyone. What a treat to be here. It's my first time visiting DePaul, and I'm super appreciative of Diane Horowitz for organizing this incredible Spring Issues Forum. I know that she organizes these forums all the time. It's always so, eye-opening and as well as disconcerting. It's eye-opening, but it's also disconcerting because it really helps us to connect the dots and get a deeper and much more complex picture about what's going on, whether we're talking about how we work in classrooms and schools, or whether we try to understand the larger political and policy context for public education around the city and around the country. So, I'm really compelled by the argument that the way we think about activism, the way we think about social change, the way we think about societal improvement, should not be something that's abstract and something that is decontextualized. It's not the case that there is an activist or advocacy strategy that works in all contexts across time and place with the same impact always. I'm really swayed by arguments that activism and advocacy needs to respond to the particularities of the situation or context in which we find ourselves. In other words, kind of drawing on the Paulo Freirean idea, to bring about social change, you need to understand your reality. You need to name the reality. You need to name the moment. So before I talk about 4 kind of concepts that I use to think about social change, let me try to name the moment that we're in. And I want to name this moment particularly by pointing to some of the rhetoric, as well as some of the actual policy changes coming from the new federal government and the new administration. One is that we're in a constitutional crisis, that there's really some deep questions that we need to be asking about democratic governance in this country. We're at a moment of sort of the rising corporatocracy, and a corporatocracy is sort of ruled by the corporate elite, right? Making decisions that really benefit the corporate sector more than the public sector. We're seeing attacks on what would normally serve as checks and balances to a developing totalitarian rule. In other words, what helps us to keep in check or keep back the growth or the strengthening of a totalitarian rule, where it's things like the media that give us a different perspective on what's going on in the world. It's things like science and research, right? It's things like the courts that are actually set up in large part to question rules, right, that are coming down from other sectors of the government, and even the academy, right, the higher education. It's not surprising, for example, that when we see persecutions by totalitarian rulers or governors, who do they often go after? They often go after the media, the journalists. They often go after teachers. They often go after artists. They often go after, in other words, those who help us to see that the world may be different than what narratives are coming down from public officials, right? So attacks on all these checks and balances is also a part of this moment that we're in. A declining American empire, right? The strength of the US to kind of see itself as exceptional to everyone else and as dominating and better than everyone else. This is we're in a moment when this is in decline, and it goes hand in hand with growing global insecurities, right? Global unrest, in other words, is going hand in hand with what's happening to the American empire. We also see attacks on civil liberties. Look at what we're hearing about and observing regarding governmental behaviors towards refugees, undocumented immigrants, Muslims, Jews, women, people of color, the working poor, people with disabilities, transgender and other lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer people. And everything I just named overlaps deeply with the final thing I want to point out, which is attacks on public schools, on school employees, and on universities. So coming from the Trump and DeVos administration, there are at least two themes that I think define what it is that we're hearing. One is the role of the federal government, and one is the expansion of school choice and vouchers as the solution to all that's going on in education. So let me talk a little bit about both of these things. Because one of the things that you'll hear me say several times tonight is that the problem isn't only Trump and DeVos. It's not the case that what Trump and DeVos are doing has never happened before, and they're bringing these brand new ideas that are all about destroying public education. Actually, that's not happening at all. What they're actually doing is surfacing what's already been in this country, and what they're doing is building on precedent that has been in its place, that has been happening for decades, including very much so over the last 8 years. This isn't about Republican versus Democrat, and this certainly isn't only about Trump. So I do want to point to things that are unique to this administration, but a lot of what I want to talk about is the historical context that I hope will help us to connect the dots. So let's talk about the weakening of the federal government, right? A lot of people are like, ooh, maybe this is a good thing that DeVos is secretary. Why? Because she's kind of on board with saying maybe we don't need a Department of Education, or we don't at least need a very strong one, right? So the idea that we don't need a Department of Education, the idea that we're going to delegate a lot of decision-making to the states is a central part of what both of them are talking about. So let's kind of contextualize this, right? The Department of Education was formed as a standalone cabinet department in 1979. So before 79, there were 4 major offices spread throughout different different departments in the US federal government, right? And at the time that the department was formed, there was strong opposition, particularly within the Republican Party. And it's been part of the Republican Party platform for decades, right, is to not have a Department of Education. A lot of people felt like this is federal overreach. This really should be the responsibility of states and locals. Now that kind of language should be very familiar to those of us who are following federal policy. So let me give a little bit more background. So let's date this back to 1965, because 1965 was when the federal government passed the big, what's known as kind of the big education laws. It was called at the time the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESEA, right? It was part of the Civil Rights Movement, it was part of the War on Poverty, and it got reauthorized about a year and a half ago under President Obama. It's now dubbed the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. Now what's one of the major components of this law? One of the major components is that it actually weakens the federal government and it pushes a lot of decision-making authority to states and locals, right? So the call for a less powerful federal government, in other words, the criticism that the federal government has been overreaching its authority is not a new criticism. One of the things that I like to remind us, however, is that starting around 1965, the federal government began to play a very different role in public education. In fact, many historians look at the period between around the mid-1950s to around the late 1970s, and they call this period in American education the federal era, or the federal period. Some of you who study history of education will know this, right? And why is it called that? It's because up until that time, the federal government didn't play a very strong role in public education, but starting around the 50s, and particularly in the 60s, they play a much more hands-on role. And it's not about curriculum, it's not about micromanaging credentials. What was the role that the federal government was playing in this time? Well, this is the middle of the Civil Rights Movement. It was all about civil rights advocacy. The federal government, the reason it's called the federal era is because through the courts and particularly through federal legislation, the federal government began to leverage federal funding, right, to push states to comply with civil rights non-discrimination law. That is the sort of characterization of much of the major laws. Even till this day, since the 80s till now, there's not many major laws that can rival what was happening in the 60s, 70s, right? So why did that happen? In large part, it was because of the failure of desegregation, right? So 1954 was the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case, right? 54 is typically called Brown 1. A year later, they issued another decision called Brown 2. And it basically said segregation in schools, not okay, right? We need to desegregate schools. And the 55 ruling was with the infamous words of, proceed at, quote, all deliberate speed, which basically said, you need to desegregate, but you know what? Do it as quickly as you can, and we'll, cheer you on. And there really wasn't much else in the courts to push states to comply. So some of you know, there was very little happening in desegregation for about 10 years. What happened in 1965? It was the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And that is when we begin to see desegregation. Why? It's because there's something that would make states and districts begin to do things differently. It's not just a court order, it's money, right? The federal government began to leverage federal funds. They began to tie federal funds to civil rights non-discrimination law compliance, right? And that's where you begin to see changes. And from 65 until like the mid-70s, you see a series of federal laws that do exactly that, right? They tie federal funds to compliance with laws. And we see things like, well, it's actually happening even in the Civil Rights Act of '64, but the Bilingual Education Act, what later became called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, even the Education Amendments of '72 that includes Title IX around gender and sex discrimination. All of this is about the role of the federal government. And you can kind of see that many of us would argue that is a pivotal role. That is exactly what the federal government should be doing, is articulating a vision for public education that lives up to the democratic ideals that we profess. And it is saying we have a responsibility to live up to that, right? And we're going to tie the one thing that we can tie, which is federal funding, to that compliance. So what's been happening in the decades since, however, is a lot of attacks on these laws and on the role of the federal government. So when we hear now people saying we don't need the federal government, in fact, a lot of the criticisms of federal legislation that has happened since is exactly this, right? A lot of people are like, isn't this overreach? And sometimes it is. Sometimes I do think federal governments and other governments are trying to micromanage. But I do think that there is a pivotal role to play, and my kind of brief visit of history is a reminder of what role that has been, and a role that I would argue we need to insist continue. when Trump was campaigning, the other thing I want to talk about is choice and vouchers. Because when Trump was campaigning, he didn't say very much about education, but he did say one thing that was a central part, got covered in all the media. He said, how do we improve schools? We expand school choice. So how about I'm going to take $20 billion of the federal government. The federal government's budget is only about, what, 68, 69 billion? So we're talking about 30% of the federal budget would be moved into expanding school choice. He didn't say how he was going to do it, and he also didn't say that there's any research that backs up that that's going to work, because there actually isn't research that says that that's going to improve everything. He hasn't done that. We haven't seen that. Instead, what we saw is about a $9-point-something billion cut that's being proposed in his latest budget proposal, right? Which is about a 13% across the board cut for the Department of Education. Okay. So let's talk about then choice and vouchers, and what does this mean? Betsy DeVos, what is her expertise? Well, some of you saw the congressional hearings. Well, let's not go there. I mean, my point is that what she's known for is leading the struggle, leading the expansion of school choice, particularly in Michigan, right? And there are advocates of school choice, right, who would themselves say, and there's some great media articles about quotes from some of the leading advocates of school choice who are like, but Detroit was a disaster. It actually made things a lot worse in the public schools, particularly in the most struggling of schools. So why are we saying that that's a model for the nation? Okay. What I want to do is, again, look back at history, because there's something that happened in the 1950s around both school choice and vouchers that gives us the context for today. Again, it's not Trump and DeVos that's all of a sudden calling for school choice. The call for school choice, particularly in the form of expansion and deregulation of charter schools, was happening under Obama, right? Greatly. There was lots of federal funding tied to this. So it's not new. So where is this idea coming from? Where did we first hear the argument at a national scale that we should have school choice in public education? When was that first coming up? That's not new. It actually arose following the Brown decision, right? So there are many people in the 50s and increasingly in the 60s who are arguing, we don't need mandatory desegregation programs. What instead would, in some people's language, organically or naturally desegregate schools? It's school choice. Because the argument, the rhetoric was, everyone is going to want to send their kids to the best schools. It doesn't matter what cultural background or color of your skin, right? So if you have a competition for the best schools, everyone from all communities are going to be trying to get into these schools. Competition will not only drive improvement, it will organically desegregate schools. Okay. Look at the research, though, from the 80s of places like Milwaukee or places like Cincinnati, and what do we see? We see that it does not organically desegregate schools. In fact, what it often does is exacerbate segregation. Right? So school choice is not a solution to desegregation. But my point is, it kind of never was meant to be one. Right? It was not put forward by people who are trying to say, here's how we improve schools. It was put forward by people who are trying to challenge mandatory desegregation policies. There's something else that was happening in the 1950s, which is the language around vouchers. Who proposed vouchers? That didn't come from educators, right? Who proposed vouchers? It actually came from economists, particularly Milton Friedman and some of the University of Chicago sort of economists, who were saying, well, let me begin with the rhetoric, and then let's talk about the reality behind the rhetoric. So here's the rhetoric around vouchers. Competition, we know, drives improvement. It's like grocery stores in a neighborhood. If you have a monopoly, you're not going to try so hard. But if there's multiple grocery stores, you're all going to be trying harder. You're all going to be being more innovative. And it's the competition that will force us to innovate, try harder, and get better, right? And vouchers is a form of school choice. So school choice basically says, rather than assigning you to your neighborhood school based on residence, we're going to let you choose from either a subset of the district or in some places the entire district. Okay, so you can choose from the public schools. Vouchers takes that one step further to say, rather than allowing you to choose only from the public schools, we'll allow you to choose from any school, and that includes the private and parochial religious-based schools, and we're going to tie some tax funding to that. So the money that would normally go to a neighborhood school, we're going to allow that to move with you in the form of a voucher that you can apply to. Either, in some cases, it's tax credits. In some cases, it's actually the tuition of the schools. Okay? Vouchers. So the rhetoric is that competition will drive improvement. But if you look at some of the writings from the 1950s by people like Friedman himself, what are they arguing? They aren't arguing that this is about improving education. Their argument was, and there's some great quotations again from Milton Friedman, I encourage you all to Google, to hear him talk about how vouchers, in his language, is not a means, no, it's not the end. It is a means. And it is a means to what? It is a means to privatize education, right? Because there are many people who would say that the public sector has failed. Public schools have failed. So why leave it up to the government? What's going to make things better? Marketizing the system, privatizing the system, forcing improvement, including from private schools, right? Forcing competition, including from private schools. All right, so that's sort of the historical context for two of the biggest things that we're hearing from this current administration. One is the weakening role or the shrinking role of the federal government, and the other is the expansion of school choice and vouchers. Let me try to then connect these two things as I talk about how I am making sense of what's going on and what we need to do about it. So some of you know I like to think in terms of alliteration. So I have 4 points, and they all begin with the letter P. All right, so let me talk about the problem of common sense, the purposes of education, the practices of solidarity, and the promises of movement building. So the problem of common sense. So I grew up in Hawaii. It was 97, I think. Anyways, late 90s when I went back to Hawaii one time, and I was looking at the paper. It was the fall, we were gearing up for the election. And on the ballot at the time was this referendum to amend the state constitution, to add an amendment to the state constitution that basically would give the legislature the authority to prohibit same-sex marriage. So it's an anti-same-sex marriage legislation. And I'm mentioning this because of the ad for this legislation, right? So people who were in favor of banning same-sex marriage, it was a full-page ad, and the title of the ad was, "It's Just Common Sense." And if you read it, they go on to say, it's just common sense that marriage is between a man and a woman, right? That's the argument. Of course I disagree with that, but what I want to say is, I thought that framing was brilliant. So here's why I think that's brilliant. Because if you can make something sound commonsensical, you've kind of won the debate, right? There's this great article, just side note, so those of you who like to study history of education, I don't know if you're reading this in your classes. It's an old piece. It was written in '94. I say old because I was reading it when I was in grad school. It's a piece by Tyack and Tobin called The Grammar of Schooling. The Grammar of Schooling? Grammar of Schooling? No. All right. So The Grammar of Schooling kind of talks about school reforms over the past century. And it's saying, let's look at some of the major attempts to change public education. Why did they fail? The argument of the historians is that they failed when they bumped up against what is common sense. So if common sense tells you that the school year should run from September to June, and someone comes along and says, hey, how about some year-round schooling? You're facing this really uphill battle, right? And same with any major reform. If it bumps up against common sense, people are going to have a hard time getting behind it. And by the way, there's a flip side to that argument as well, right? Which is that you can have the worst idea in the world, but if you can make it sound commonsensical, you're more likely to get everyone to buy into it. So I like to say, all right, so let's look then again at education, because there's some great examples of things going on in education that make us question common sense. About 100 years ago, it's kind of commonsensical to say that if you were a girl, you should not get too much education. And indeed, girls either didn't go to school or they went to school till maybe 5th grade. All right, so why did we say that? Well, some people believe that women belonged in the home, and some people believe that women would compete with men for jobs. But some of you are aware that around 100, actually it was maybe a little over 100 years ago, there was kind of a common sense of that time that went something like this. The mind is connected to the body. And if you mess up with one, you might mess up the other. So if girls got too much education, they might go crazy. They might become physically ill, or they might even become infertile. I know, you do your homework and you can't have babies. Like, who came up with that argument, right? But my point is that for many people, that was just considered to be common sense. About 50 years ago, for many people, it was commonsensical to say that if you had darker skin, you should not get too much education. And why do we believe that? Well, some people believe that there will be competition for jobs, but some of you are probably keenly aware that about 50 years ago, there was kind of even a science of the time that told us something like this. People of darker skin did not have as much intellectual capacity, they're not as smart. So why should we waste our time and our resources teaching them? It's kind of the bell curve argument, right? It's commonsensical. For many people, even today, there are some people who believe in that idea. And I say this not to poke fun at people 50 or 100 years ago, but really to raise the much bigger question of 50 years from now. How might we look back and say, oh, I can't believe in 2017 it was commonsensical to think this? Right? What is the common sense of our time that we're not even recognizing is preventing us from seeing what's really going on? Right? Why do we still run the school year from September to June, or the school day from 8 till 3? Is that how schools across the world look? No, actually it's not. Is that how schools in this country always look? No, actually it's not, right? But, actually in many ways it is. But my point is that, is there research to back it up? Actually there isn't. There's no compelling body of research that tells us that that's how we should structure the school schedule. That's a historical product. That's because when mass public schooling began, we were pre-industrial at the time, right? We were still an agricultural society. Why do we group people 30 or 40 per classroom? Why do we divide the subjects 50 minutes of math, 50 minutes of reading? In fact, even things like why is it that the older you get, the more likely you are to receive instruction like this, where someone is standing in front and talking for nonstop for like 45 minutes. Like why do we do that? Hopefully it will not take 50 years for us to look back and say, oh, I can't believe in 2017 this was the common sense, right? One of the major roles of education is to challenge common sense. This is what I would argue, right? Education is not simply about assimilating us into the ways of thinking. This is why so much of standards-based reform misses the boat. Because that really is about getting us to think the way that those in power want us to think. And is that really about education? I see my colleague, mentor, friend, Bill Ayer sitting back there who likes to ask the question, what's the difference between public education in a totalitarian society versus one in a democratic one? What should education look like if we're trying to prepare people to be active participants in a democratic society? Okay? I would argue that education should not be about preparing us to fit into the world as it is, but rather it should be preparing us to imagine and to create the world as it is not yet. Imagine and create the world as it could be, right? And that's why education can be so scary. And that's the kind of education that so many, therefore, don't want. I'm going to come back to this in a moment, but I'm going to make the argument, if you can kind of just bookmark this, that both conservatives and liberals back in the 1970s was arguing that there's too much democracy. And why? Because there's too much education. So let's come back to that argument in a moment. But education is scary. That's why it's so under attack. That's why it's so needed. That's why we need to engage in this struggle. My next point is the purposes of education. So this is kind of what I'm getting at, right? Why schools? There's so much rhetoric around equal educational opportunity, around leveling the playing field. All right, let me give another kind of swing back to history to kind of remind myself and hopefully many in this room that that's not always how we talked about the purposes of education. Why schools? The predecessors to the earliest public schools, the predecessors to public schools is what's called common schools in this country, right, in the 1800s. What was the purpose of common schools? Was it about leveling the playing field? No, because actually most people weren't allowed to go to common schools, right? It was mainly, am I right, white boys in families that owned property, I think, were the people who were primarily attending the common schools at the time. Right? Was it about preparing you for your job? No, not really. And was it even about reading, writing, and arithmetic? I would say not really. A major, if not the major goal of common schools was actually moral education and socialization. Look at the curriculum of the time, right? What about 100 years later during the Cold War? Right? What was the goal at that time? Well, particularly following the launch of Sputnik and everyone in the US being like, we're losing the space race. How can we lose out to the communists? We need to ramp up our education system. It was in large part about kind of this global competitiveness, right? It fueled the American imperialism, right? How about the 1970s? Oh, this is what I was going to talk about. All right, so the 1970s is this interesting moment where you see the birth of the conservative movement and this interesting argument within the liberal movement. So, 1970s, this is immediately following the civil rights movement. And there are many who felt that, oh, these activists have managed to change laws and policies in favor of diversity, multiculturalism, whatever. Maybe if we can do some long-term strategizing, we can also change law and policy to favor, right, corporations and businesses. And this is in large part the beginning of the conservative revolution, right? Well, at the same time that that was happening, the early 1970s, there was also things happening among the political left. And I'm referencing here something called the Trilateral Commission. So the Trilateral Commission is also a product of the Cold War. It's also immediately following the Civil Rights Movement. This brings together Western Europe, Japan, and the United States. And by 1974, they issued their big report. And one of the things that they argued, so think about this, right? Early 1970s, what was happening in the US? We just saw a lot of turmoil around civil rights movement. What was happening around the world, particularly in Latin America? We were also seeing lots of social strife and turmoil. Okay, so that's part of what the Trilateral Commission was trying to answer is, what's going on? Why so much social unrest? Ignoring that there's been unrest and revolution throughout the history of our planet. But anyway, my point is that what they did is they issued their report in '74. And one of the arguments that they're making is that the reason that there's so much revolution and turmoil is because there's, quote, too much democracy, right? The masses think that they have the right like everyone else. What's up with that, right? And they want to kind of change and improve society. And where did they get this? It's from education. And it's not surprising, right? Those of you who follow the quantitative measures of education will know that the thing that the 80s got fixated on, the so-called achievement gap, right? The achievement gap, if you look at the test scores throughout the 60s and 70s, was one, it was actually closing, right? It was actually getting smaller between different race groups. And why do we think that that was happening? Well, in large part, what was happening during the civil rights movement? It was like the growth of things like multicultural education. It was the growth of things like desegregation. It was even in some places we were seeing diversification of the teaching force, right? It's the things that we know are going to improve education was actually happening. And as a result, for many populations, at least by measured by test scores, we're actually seeing improvement. Early 2000s is No Child Left Behind, and this is where we begin to hear language around college and career readiness. This is where we got really fixated with education is all about preparing young people for the future. In other words, what makes a young person valuable? It's that they're a future adult. We got really fixated on this idea that what we're teaching are simply something that's about to be, not something that for someone or an individual that is valuable in and of themselves. We lost sight of the value of children, and we began to see them only as future adults. Now, what's one of the main ways that we talk about education? Why is it that we don't care that we're defunding education? Why is it that our nation doesn't care that we want to expand private school choice, marketization, vouchers, all of that? It's because we're increasingly thinking of education as a commodity, right? As something that those who have can afford to buy better, right? It's why the slashing of even things like state-funded public education institutions, it doesn't seem to rile people up because we're no longer buying into the story that education is a public good. We're much more buying into the story that education is like a commodity that we should be able to shop for, right? Now, I want to contrast these 5 ways of thinking about the purposes of education with one final one. And it's one that not only people were using in the middle of the civil rights movement, it's also one that was actually echoing things that we heard post-abolition or post-slavery. And that is that education or schools are about freedom, are about liberation, are about empowerment, are about emancipation. And that is another very powerful way to think about the purposes of education, which you certainly don't hear a lot of today. Lots of great ways of thinking about the purposes of education. Let me contrast this with one final thought, which is that the purpose is only one thing we need to be focusing on. We can debate as much as we want the purposes of education. That's a kind of an impoverished debate if you're not also thinking about the function of education, right? What do we want to accomplish versus what are we actually accomplishing? And what I think many would argue is that the function of education is often exactly the opposite of what we purport to be the purpose. If you're arguing that schools are all about leveling the playing field, prepare everyone to succeed, equal educational opportunity, let's remind ourselves that that was never the purpose of public schools in this country. We created public schools for kind of the most elite, and as we were forced to integrate and incorporate more and more, we just came up with more and more ways to divide, differentiate, and sort, right? Such as through segregation, such as through tracking, such as through labeling. The purpose might be equal educational opportunity, but the function has historically been to sort. And this is why some people are like, well, schools have been failing, right? First of all, let's question even that rhetoric, because I would say actually the achievement gap or any measure that schools are failing might not be a sign that schools are failing. It's actually a sign that schools are succeeding. They're kind of accomplishing what they were kind of set up to do, right? But I would also say this isn't a reason to give up on public schools, because just as schools have always served this sorting function, I would say that schools have also always been a site of struggle. And this is the case in countries around the world, in industrializing nations, in imperialist nations, in, anytime we see, those of you who study comparative education, you'll see, right, that when nations set up mass schooling systems, they often serve a socializing function, but they also are often where revolutions begin. Where do a lot of revolutions begin? They begin in higher education. They begin on campus grounds, right? This is where we struggle to define who we are and what we are to become. And this is why the struggle over public education is so vital. Dive into that contradiction is the point I want to make. The practices of solidarity, my third point. All right, quick story. So I was interviewing this father who had adopted a boy who was 3 years old. And in his first 3 years of life, the boy had been in 11 different foster homes. Now, some of you study child development and you know that the first 2 years are so crucial to forming a sense of self. And you form your sense of self in large part because of how you interact and relate to other people. So if you've been bounced around from home to home, imagine how that affects your sense of self and your sense of self-worth, right? Not surprisingly, this child wasn't following what the adult said, could not interact with other kids in a healthy way. Preschool after preschool was saying to this father, we can't handle him, you have to take him somewhere else. Finally, the father began to conclude that our systems seem to think that some kids are disposable. This is the word that he was using, that we seem to think that some of our children are disposable kids. How did we get to this point, he asked, where we think that some kids are not my responsibility. Let some other school or the healthcare system, the juvenile justice system, the welfare system, let them take care of them. They don't have to be in my school. They certainly don't have to be in my classroom. How did we get to a point where we think that some kids are not our responsibility? I like to tell that story because there's a flip side of that story where sometimes we think that everyone's our responsibility, and I am becoming a teacher because I want to help everybody. Or I want to empower everybody. Not everybody. I want to empower those most in need. Or I'm here to save people who need help. All right. I mean, first of all, let me just say yay to those of you who want to be teachers. But I want to actually challenge the idea that we're here to save anybody. Because I think that there's a big difference between sort of looking down and saying, oh, I'm going to save you and make you more like me, versus I'm here to walk in solidarity with others. Right? Solidarity is where I see that not I'm different than you, I'm better than you. It's actually where you insist that your struggle is my struggle, that your oppressions that you're facing is intertwined and inseparable from the oppressions that I experience, that your children, in other words, are my children as well. Right? I'm reminded of one of my mentors who likes to say, how dare, right? How dare that you call yourself a social justice advocate? How dare that you even call yourself a public school educator if you're not willing to be a champion for those whose differences make you the most uncomfortable. Those whose differences make you the most uncomfortable. Activism and justice work isn't about saying I'm only here to advocate for people who look like me, or people who think like me, or people who are like me, right? I mean, that's important. But I think her point is to remind ourselves that even in activist spaces, we create margins. Even within communities that we call our own, there are the abject, those that are pushed away. And so our job is to constantly ask, who even in my spaces am I going to insist are my responsibility? Even if your skin color conjures up images, stereotypes in my mind, even if I don't understand you or I pretend not to because your accent is so strong, or even if your sexual orientation or gender presentation is something I don't understand, or even if I disagree with laws around documentation status, I can go on and on, right? We all have these biases that we all need to work through, and our job is not to pretend they're not there. Our job is to insist that that's the center of my work. Right? And I say this because I think when I began my presentation, and I'm talking about the attacks on civil liberties on groups, it makes me think, A, the mass kind of almost spontaneous looking mobilizations, they should be happening all the time. Because we should be insisting that every one of these groups is us. And furthermore, they should be happening no matter who is president, right? I'm reminded of when election day was happening and I was driving to campus, I was convinced Clinton was going to win. I didn't want Trump to win, but I was still very upset at the idea that Clinton was going to win. And why? Well, there are many reasons, but let me give the big one, which is my concern was that a Clinton win might give the political left, the liberal wing of this country 4 more years of sitting back and being complacent and being like, all right, now we have a woman president, she's going to save us. No, that's not the case at all. And that then leads to my 5th point about the promises of movement building. So, we cannot just be decrying Trump and DeVos. We need to be decrying Trump and DeVos, or we need to be calling them out on any policy that goes against democratic ideals and justice principles and a vision of what is the promises of public education. However, that cannot be our only work. And here I'm reminded of some of the presidents who were in office at the time of some of the most kind of transformative moments in US history. I think about Abraham Lincoln at the time of abolition, Franklin Roosevelt at the time of kind of the end of the Great Depression, New Deal, World War II, Lyndon Johnson at the time of the Civil Rights Movement, and Ronald Reagan at the time of the Conservative Revolution. Very different presidents, very much disagreeing with one another. However, something ties all of them together. I was reading this wonderful article that was saying the great transformations happening in this country weren't happening because of these leaders. In fact, these changes were happening even before these leaders came into office, right? The changes happened not simply because of a leader. Changes happened because of social movements. And in fact, at the time of these leaders, there were social movements pushing the leaders to do the right thing. Right? Was Lincoln elected on a campaign for abolition? Absolutely not, right? He changed his views while in office because of a powerful social movement, right? What was happening at the time of Franklin Roosevelt? It was the New Labour and the left populist movement. What was happening at the time of Lyndon Johnson? The Civil Rights Movement. What was happening at the time? What helped Reagan get elected? It was the conservative movement. He didn't launch it, right? He was elected in large part because of it. So my point here is that when we talk about education, this isn't only about leaders. It's not even only about law and policy. What we actually need to be asking ourselves is, what is the social movement around education that we need to be building? And let me quickly define as my last point then, social movements. Because social movements are not simply movements that change policy. Think about the civil rights movement, right? The major successes of the movement. Leaders at the time of the civil rights movement were telling us that they were actually compromises. They were steps forward and steps back. Think about Brown, think about Civil Rights Act, think about Elementary and Secondary Education Act. It isn't policy changes that define movements. What makes social movements so powerful is that they rattle and shift public consciousness and common sense. The civil rights movement was powerful not only because of changing law, but because it changed how we as a nation thought and talked about things like race and rights and diversity and democracy. Same with the Occupy movement, right? I would argue, very, very powerful movement. Did it change any law and policy in its immediate wake? Actually, no. It was powerful because it shifted public consciousness. It made household language things like the 1%. Right, the 99%, the privileged, the masses, Black Lives Movements, another powerful movement. Are policies changing? Yeah, absolutely. Look at university campuses across the country. We do see attention to policy, but what's more powerful is the shift in consciousness, the shift in common sense. My argument is that if we're going to tackle education policy, if we're going to tackle education change, what we really need to be doing is pushing for a much bolder vision for what public education can be and what we are invested in building. These are some of the challenges, opportunities, and questions that I urge us to grapple with as we engage in this important work, and I hope that this presentation helps in that effort. Thanks very much.
Go with this thing. Oh dear, I don't have to go from slide to slide. Here we go. Okay. So I'm Cassie Cresswell. I'm with an organization called Raise Your Hand, and we sort of have two parts. We have a sort of research and parent training and sort of informational arm. That's Raise Your Hand. And now we've expanded to do more legislative advocacy, and that's Raise Your Hand Action. So I'll sort of really switch gears, I think, from the previous talks, because now I just feel like this is much more like the mundane details of the ugliness that can happen. I'll first talk about vouchers. And what these policies could look like at the state level. One thing about vouchers that you should know is that actually vouchers are not very popular, and generally they don't hold that well. And so people have been coming up with new ways to frame them and new techniques to sort of cover up what they are. But all of these different ways really still just divert public money into private hands, and it sort of depends on what part of the tax and revenue stream that you do that diversion that gives you a different way to refer to it. So in the most basic form of a voucher, the state will pay families or make payments to private schools to cover tuition costs. Sort of a new way to frame that, though, is with educational savings accounts. And so in this, you sort of make a little more distance between the state paying the private school by depositing money into an educational savings account, and then families can use that to spend on tuition or fees in different ways. Sort of even more devious way to do vouchers is something called the tax credit scholarship program. So in this way, you actually take the money even before it actually is collected as taxes and hand it over to a private organization that can then spend it on private school tuition. So you set up something called a scholarship organization or a tuition scholarship organization, and that's a third party, it's usually a nonprofit, and then you make tax incentives so that businesses or individuals can get tax credits by contributing to that organization, and then the money that they contribute can be used, handed out as scholarships to private schools for K-12. And then the contributors get tax credits, so they're paying less money into the general revenue fund. They may also get charitable donation deductions, and so they could actually kind of make money by doing these schemes. So the Network for Public Education refers to this as money laundering, and it really is just sort of a way to kind of pull apart the state handing money over to private schools by adding some of these extra steps in. Another thing that actually already exists here in Illinois is an education expense tax credit. So here the family gets money off their tax credits or off their taxes, and that can be used to cover private school tuition. There was a bill in the General Assembly this year that wanted to expand that. Right now it's just $500 per family, but if you increase that enough, then it could actually cover some higher tuition costs. But you know, the commonality here is that all of these are shrinking the money available that could be used for public schools. And you never hear people proposing voucher programs like this in any of these forms where they say, and we'd like to expand education funding in general to cover these new things. You're always just cutting up the same pie. You're not making a bigger pie and then handing some of it off to private schools. So that's something to keep in mind with all of these. So I've covered this a little bit. So there's a ton of problems with diverting money this way. So one is that we're already underfunding public schools. So Illinois in particular is 50 out of 50, almost always, for the amount that the state spends for public education. And we have a really inequitable public education funding system where the poorest communities or the neediest kids get the least for schools, and the richest communities with the children with the least need have the best education funding. And so as you shrink especially say the general state aid size, you're just exacerbating all the problems we already have. Another issue is that if you're paying religious schools or religious institutions, this is a violation of the Establishment Clause, and so there's currently, this is up for debate right now in the Supreme Court. Illinois also has a constitution clause on this saying that we can't pay religious institutions. So until those are overturned, these programs violate that if you're using these funds for private schools that are run by religious institutions. Another big problem is that actually, the justification for this is that is often that we're going to improve the educational experience for the children who get these vouchers, but really there's been no studies of long-term voucher programs that have shown that you're getting improved academic outcomes. And in fact, recent studies have begun to show that you're getting worse outcomes in some cases. And so that's an aspect of you're actually going to increase inequity. Another aspect of increasing inequity is that these vouchers are almost never big enough to cover elite private schools. And often they aren't enough even to cover full tuition at any private school. And so there's other barriers to accessing a voucher and then using it to go to something other than your neighborhood school. And those are often make them out of reach as well. So unless you have transportation to your private school, it's going to be a problem. Another big area is that private schools don't have to follow the same laws as public schools, particularly these laws that Kevin was mentioning, like Title IX, IDEA, and things that are preventing discrimination in public schools on the basis of gender or ability or race. And unless you put into your voucher program that these schools will have to follow these laws, you're really handing over money to private institutions that are not going to fulfill the promise of public schools. And so in some cases we've seen voucher programs for students with disabilities where parents are actually signing away any rights under IDEA in exchange for accepting that voucher. So this is really problematic. So it's not clear in what form vouchers could come to Illinois. The state, the General Assembly considered a voucher bill not that many years ago, and it did get some traction. It passed the state Senate. It died in the House. And so that's, it's possible that something like this could pass in the General Assembly. Another issue is that it might be something that just our State Board of Education could approve some kind of voucher program, and they wouldn't ask the state legislature for approval. And there is some precedent for that. We got a very large grant from the feds for charters recently that the state legislature was not asked to approve. So there's ways that the federal government can offer money. So all of this went kind of long. So I'll talk now more about what we can actually do. And there's really a lot of things. So this is really from the perspective of our organization as a grassroots parent organization and the sorts of ways we've been tackling these problems. So step one is to educate yourself. Coming to forums, reading stuff online is sort of like the basic thing, so you know about what issues are going on. The next is to actually connect with people in your community. One thing we have here in Chicago is local school councils. So your neighborhood schools, high school and elementary, will have a local school council where you can connect with other people who are, care about their local schools and care about public education. There's also community organizations, which we'll hear about from Cheryl, and that's another really valuable way in the city to plug into people working on public education issues. A really key thing is once you connect with other people, you have to talk to your state legislators. And so I think this is something that you may not even know who your state rep and state senator are. Most people do not. So I encourage you to find this out. When I was going to do a little demo here of looking this up, but if you use this link, the first person that comes up is your U.S. congressman, who is an important guy, probably a guy because that's U.S. And they do have influence. They work on education issues, but so much happens at the state level, and that's what you need to keep in mind. You really need to talk to these state level legislators. And that's something we do as an organization. We connect parents and community members in legislative districts, and then we help them connect to their state legislators. The amazing thing about your state legislator is that they probably don't hear from their constituents very often, and although just one person making a call, you'll just be that crazy person making a call. But if you have 3 friends who also call, that suddenly becomes an issue that's on their radar. And so it doesn't take that much movement to have your state legislator know who you are and know what issues you care about and start caring about the issues that you care about. So all you have to start with is looking them up and finding their phone number. So there's a lot of stuff that is on the table right now. There's not currently voucher bills that seem that viable in the state General Assembly. Anything can happen, like the things can disappear and then reappear on the agenda. But we are currently working on a campaign with about 20 other organizations, both statewide organizations, then a lot of community organizations in Chicago. We formed a coalition, and we're asking our state reps and our state senators to sign a letter saying that they will publicly oppose the establishment of voucher programs in Illinois. So that's sort of a preemptive move because, as I said before, we don't really know what form this could happen in Illinois. And before it gets off the ground, we want to really make a fuss and have people say, oh, this is not going to be an easy fight to have here at the state level. And so that's really sort of our goal, even though there's not a bill right now that we're necessarily battling. We really want the General Assembly, especially the leaders, to take note that people are organizing now, and it's not going to be an easy sell to the Illinois populace that we have school vouchers. So I think that's the main thing. If you are interested in any of this, you can get involved at a variety of levels, and you can get on our mailing list, and we'll send out an action alert and say, call your state rep about this bill, or call your state senator about this bill. And you can also get involved more deeply than that. But just paying attention to what legislation is happening is sort of the introductory step to doing what you can in the political climate. So.
Hello, everyone. So I'm gonna sit because I have a broken ankle, and it kind of hurts to stand up. So again, my name's Cheryl Flores, and I work with the Brighton Park Neighborhood Council. And so I'm gonna speak a little bit about all the work we've been doing. Obviously, since we've been founded, but clearly in the last couple of months, it's really been a lot of work, our immigration work, and how it ties into education, right? Like, why are we talking about immigration when this is about education? If you don't see the connection, I'm sure as I talk about it, you clearly will understand why. So our BPNC is a community-based organization in Brighton Park on the southwest side of Chicago. And we are an organization that I believe is very unique because we provide both those social services to a lot of community members, but we also have an organizing entity, right? And so our work is not siloed, so there's not an organizing arm to our organization and the social services, but I think what makes this work great is that everything is very much embedded, right? And so a lot of the services we provide is through our full service community schools partnerships that we have in Brighton Park. And so currently we have 6 of those partnerships. And what is that, if you're not familiar with it, is really we provide a lot of resources in those schools, right? Working with the administrators, the students, the parents, and really understanding where are the gaps in that school and how do we provide those services together, right? As you can imagine, a lot of those services do come in counseling, right? We have case managers, counselors, college mentors, programming for parents and for students. And so I bring all this up because when we heard who won the election, right, we were all in shock and knew that it was going to get tough for us as an organization, for our community, right? We were all really worried, scared, because we didn't know, right? We didn't know what was going to happen, and we knew that people were going to want answers. And so on day one, right, we got to work. And so what's happened is that if you go into the classrooms, and a lot of you are studying to become teachers, what you'll see is that you have second graders, right, scared of their parents being deported. You have high school age students who are DACA students, so that's Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival. And so they're worried, right? What's going to happen to me? Am I going to go to school, or am I going to be sent back home? Like, what does that mean, right? You have parents who are scared to leave their house to pick up their students from school, right? You have them worried to go to work. And so it's created a lot of fear in our community, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of anxiety, right? And even lack of motivation in some students, right? Like, what's the point of getting an education when I don't even know what's going to happen with me? And so I bring that up because it is all very real. You see it in a lot of students and even teachers, right? Like, how do I address this in the classroom? How do I talk? Do I bring it up to the whole classroom? Do I talk to them, outside? How do you do that? And I think it's, again, something that's happening, that before we knew about it, and we knew we had undocumented students, right? But right now it's very much like front and center. Every day you're facing that. And so what we as an organization have been doing, we've been doing a couple things, and so I'm just going to talk about some of the strategies that we've tried within our organization, and other organizations have also been doing some of this work in Chicago. So one of the things we started to do was just know your rights workshops, right? They have rights, we all have rights, and so just knowing what those are, providing it in your language, right? So in our community, it's Spanish speaking, so providing sometimes those workshops in Spanish at a time that people can attend those workshops, right? And usually at our schools, because guess what? That's where parents feel the most safe, right? Going to the school where their child goes and providing those workshops. To this day, we've provided, I think, since January, maybe close to 200 Know Your Right workshops, and that's including also workshops about citizenship, right? We provide citizenship classes on the weekends and during the week after school hours, right? Because again, that's part of being a full service community school, is that you're not just there to provide programming from school hours, right? It's really to create these hubs in the community and create a vibrant community in Brighton Park for us. And so the Know Your Right workshops have been very successful. And after that, right, there was still many questions from our parents and from community members, right? Like, okay, now I know my rights, but what do I do if ICE comes to my door? What if ICE comes to the school? What does that mean? And so our organizers, our school-based staff, all of us really sat together, right? Because again, it's not just one arm of the organization that sees this work. It's really everybody goes through it or sees it in a different way, right? If you're an ACA navigator, you really do hear those problems from people, right? People who come to receive public benefits, right? It's a different set of issues that they're facing. If you're a counselor, right, and you're talking to the students, you're seeing a different part of that problem. If you work with parents. And so, again, it's really about working together as an organization and kind of how do we address this, right? And so the second part of that was creating deportation plans, right? An action plan. And so, again, it's not to instill fear in our community, right, because they're scared as it is, but it's about, okay, if this really is a possibility, which it has, right, it has occurred, what can we do together? What can you do to make sure that you're as prepared as possible so that you leave things in a little better, situation for your child, for your significant other if something were to happen to you, right? And so we talk about if you have property, what should you do with that property? Having a conversation with your student, right? Because imagine if you didn't and then one day you're just not there as a parent, how does that leave the student? We talk about, savings accounts if they have it, houses if they have it. We talk about knowing the difference between ICE and a police officer and a TSA, right? They all have a badge. What does a badge look like? Really understanding and reaching out to other organizations who might have lawyers available to, access that kind of legal support. So it's very much, I think, a comprehensive plan, again, for people who are in that situation to access and really think about through the different steps that they are going to come across at some point. Hopefully not, right? But at least it's there. And so that again is another part of this plan. And so another strategy that we've also been doing is sanctuary school work. And so sanctuary schools, as of now, right? I think a lot of Chicago public schools are like, yeah, we're in support, we're a sanctuary school. What does that mean, really, right? Does that mean you're providing sanctuary for a student for a few days? Does that mean you don't open the doors to ICE, which you shouldn't, right? What does that mean? And so, again, it's about working with people, right? It's not coming in and saying, we have all the answers. It's about working with teachers especially, right? And students and the administrators and parents, like coming together and coming up with a plan for each school. Because although we're all in Brighton Park, every school is very much different, right? And so coming together and really understanding, who are the allies within the school, right? Are all the teachers on board? Because although they're all teachers, maybe, again, different individuals have different thought process, and some might want to become an advocate for students and some might not, and that's fine, right? But for the teachers who do, really educating them on what does this all mean, right? And how can I support my student in the classroom, right? How can I have them know that I'm an ally, that if they have questions, that if they're scared, that if something happened to their mom or their dad, that I'm here, that I know what to do, right? I have a plan. If ICE comes to this school, you can reach me, and these are the steps. This is the protocol for our school, right? And again, it's very different at every school. We have buildings, some schools that are 100+ years old, and so we can't really have a home, have a family or have a student there for more than a day, right? But then we have newer schools in our community that have access to showers, already 5 minutes. It goes by fast up here. Who have access to a washer and dryer, So again, things logistically just to plan out with your school about what, again, we can do for our students. And really, again, it's about talking about the issue and what we see in the classroom because, again, you can't teach somebody and worry about test scores or how much growth or XYZ if you're not talking about the trauma that they're experiencing in their community and at home. And right now, our young people are going through a lot, and unless we figure out together how to address that, I assure you there's not going to be much, academic achievement occurring in the classroom. So although, yes, we are educators, but we have to also keep in mind and very much present that our young people are going through these issues, and how can I, put on my advocacy hat here and help them and their families, because again, I think it's something that no one has all the answers, no one organization. It's about working together with several organizations and just collectively, thinking how can we address this, because this is immigration, but it very much is also an education issue. It's a social justice issue. So, I encourage you all. BPNC, I think, takes on a lot of other issues as well. If you're interested in more of the work that we do, I will be sitting around. So by all means, just come and ask if you're, more interested in our organizing work and the work with teachers. We had some plans out there. I think everyone took them, but if you guys have questions, by all means, there's also other ally organizations that we work with, and so if you're on the north side, we can connect you with another organization or, a different part of the city. So thank you all.
All right, good evening. My name is Brandon Johnson, and when I saw that the schedule was set for 5:30 to 8:30, this forum, and saw how many folks were here, it's hard to imagine folks would sign up to sit through something for 3 hours on a Tuesday night. And it occurred to me that most folks in here are probably students, and I really feel bad for you all. 3 hours, I mean, boy, you all clearly are making me feel a little special to hang around this long, so I'll do my best to sort of parrot all the collective thought here. I brought a bunch of stuff because I knew I was going to be on the panel with some pretty brilliant people. So I brought all the technology and notes and stuff. There's nothing on it. It was just to look impressive. So I hope I accomplished that. And I'm sorry, and then you have Bill Ayers just kind of roaming around the back. This is just an amazing night to be part of a great conversation. Most meetings that I do go to, though, we run out of juice, donuts, never out of handouts. Like, you all are very, very impressive. So I have to make an adjustment. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little giggly. My wife just texted me and my son struck out, so I'm really struggling right now. But it's all about preparing for the future, all right? So, and he's left-handed too, so we have big dreams for Owen. So I just have a few moments here. I'm just going to run through a couple of numbers here. I think people have laid out pretty clearly the fallacy of the neoliberal agenda that's been carried out by the previous administration under Obama, and what has paved the way essentially for Betsy DeVos and Trump. But what I am encouraged by in this moment, though, and I hope that you all are doing some deep reflection about the movement that we are part of. For the first time in the U.S. history, a sitting vice president had to cast a tie-breaking vote to confirm a nominee. And that nominee was for education. That movement began here in Chicago, you all. I don't want people to feel discouraged. I don't want people to feel hopeless. The fact that you had to have a vice president cast the deciding vote, not for it, listen, is as much of a whack job as Jeff Sessions is and all the other appointees, the EPA, no one believes in the departments in which they've been appointed over, but the fact that the debate around public education has created such a national, created such national frustration says an awful lot about the work that we've been a part of here in Chicago, and there are brilliant people in this room who've been a part of that. There are a few numbers that I'll run through though real quickly. 75%, 80%, 90%, 3 and 1. Do I sound like I'm a professor? I'm trying to sound real professor, real impressive. You know, I should have 4 points in the scripture given the fact that my father's a pastor, but his job was not unionized, so it didn't work out. You know, when they get the Chicago Preachers Union, I'm all on board. So in the meantime, you know, teach social studies at the middle school level, and those of you in here who want to teach at the middle school level, since I'm not a pastor, I have pretty much cleared myself for eternity, though, having taught middle school. Pretty much just walk right on into heaven. So, but 75%, this movement that we are a part of, Sisters and Brothers, is a movement that certainly predates me, many of us in this room, but we played a really important role over the last 6 or 7 years. At the height of Rahm Emanuel's popularity, he was elected with the energy of the first black president and the blessing of the first black president, had a 70% approval rating when he came in. And the CTU, working with community partners like BPNC and Raise Your Hand and other organizations, the first round of school actions that the mayor proposed back in 2011, the coalition decided to walk past the mayor's house and march on his block. Like literally, let's march past his house, let's take the message to his front door. And it was that type of bold, radical agenda, that type of response shifted the political dynamics in this city. What are those numbers? 75% of parents who send their kids to public schools support the Chicago Teachers Union vision for public schools. 80% of black families support the CTU. Now, why that's important? Because I was raised black, just if you haven't noticed. There was a brief stint in college. It was my roommate, Green Day. It was just real confusing. Including the goldfish, but I've gotten over it. But to be able to get 80% of black folks to agree with anything is pretty impressive, right? My black family, we argue over the Thanksgiving menu meal every year, and it's the same menu, right? The very policies that have caused tremendous harm within our neighborhoods, these people overwhelmingly support the idea of what public education should be. It was W.B. Du Bois that said that public education at the expense of the state, after all, is a Negro idea. The very idea that was birthed out of our pain, the very group of people who have been marginalized, who been experimented on, these folks have shifted their desires of not just accepting what has been presented in front of them, but demanding something greater. 90% of people in Chicago support an elected representative school board. The expansion of democracy here in Chicago. The question of ERSB was on the ballot in 37 wards. More people voted for an elected representative school board in 37 wards than all 50 wards combined voting for Rahm Emanuel. If ERSB was the candidate, we would have a new mayor. That's a movement we are a part of, Sisters and Brothers. It's a movement based on the type of radical, bold vision that has been put forth, not just by the CTU, but community organizations who've been a part of the struggle for some time. The last set of numbers, 3-1. The New York Times did an exit poll after the 2015 mayoral race. If education was your #1 issue, those voters broke for Chuy Garcia, Commissioner Garcia, 3-1. You've won the argument, Sisters and Brothers. But here's the challenge, though. You can win the argument and still lose some of the political battles. But the good news is there's tremendous opportunity in this moment. With all of the support that we have, with all the organizing that's happening, where across the board you're seeing even people like Cory Booker, who is a privatizer, who believes in undermining the rights of workers, who believes in the idea of limiting black families' ability to actually secure the type of economic justice that can make families whole. As the professor said earlier, at the height, the only thing that I would add to the brother professor is at that time when the achievement gap began to narrow, it was also the height of unionization. But it turns out when people are working, students learn. Someone asked me, what's the best thing your father ever did for you in your education success? I said, the brother had W-2s. Went to work. You know, if people think that my dad in the 70s and 80s spent time looking over my shoulder trying to figure out the 5 causes of the American Revolution, I promise you he didn't. But he went to work. And so it's these ideas that we're ultimately pushing and promoting in this moment. And what does that look like legislatively? As much as I appreciate the conscious shift in our moment, and that's necessary, the conscious shift, winning the debate, winning the argument, convincing people that there's greater opportunity in this moment, you have to codify some of this stuff in law if you're going to see the type of dramatic changes that we desperately need. And so what the CTU is promoting is, look, it's one thing to actually talk about the right of public education. It's another thing to talk about how you're going to fund it. And that becomes critical in this moment. 2/3 of corporations in Illinois do not pay an income tax, do not pay taxes, right? Bruce Rauner has the same tax rate as the woman and the man who works in the cafeteria. This is a problem. That the only solution that people like Bruce Rauner and Rahm Emanuel have is through the austerity agenda of closures, cuts, consolidation, efficiency, allowing the market to ultimately dictate whether or not my child has a science teacher or a librarian. And so we're pushing for a couple of things. As Cassie already indicated, elected representative school board, it passed out the House 18-1 in the Education Committee. It passed the House last year with 110 votes. We expect that bill to move to the House soon. The challenge, of course, is the Senate. We'll get to some things that you can do there. But the elected representative school board calls for what we've all have been calling for, and that's increasing democracy, the very thing that people who support corporatization don't want to see materialized. There's also the restoration of rights for educators. The attack on public education is certainly an attack on labor as well. And make no mistake about it, the attack on education and the attack on labor is also an attack on black people. Dr. King said the enemies of labor are the enemies of the Negro. They wanted to say. And so that's why you saw this collision, if you will, of social justice or civil rights and labor rights. Dr. King's vision was if those two were to ever to collide, what enormous potential they would have. And so in 1995, when all of this began to really become chaotic here in Chicago, when the mayor received complete control over the school system, you saw an ominous decline in black teachers. A part of that legislation in 1995 that gave the mayor complete control over the school district, teachers also lost our voice to bargain over things besides wages and benefit. Well, we just put forth legislation calling for the reinstatement of that. I'll give you that bill number, where teachers will be able to negotiate over things like class size, length of school day, third-party contracting. If you're not familiar with that, Barbara Burke Bennett is going to prison for 4.5 years because we don't have checks and balances in terms of how it relates to third-party contracting. So that's a big piece. There's the revenue, though, the millionaire's tax. It's passed out the House once. We got to move it again. There are 18,000 millionaires in Illinois. I know none of them. I'm one of my black Republican friends. You got to have one. It makes for good conversation. He asked me, can I borrow money from a friend if I need the $100. I was like, no, I don't think so. He said, what if you need 50? Could you call somebody up? I was like, I don't know. He said 20. I was like, man, I don't think so. He said, you need new friends. So that was, I'm sorry, that was my bad attempt of, okay. It's a tough crowd. It's obviously 718. But millionaires tax, 18,000 of them, we could shift the political dynamics overnight, not just fund schools, but all the services that come along that we need in these neighborhoods. The carried interest, I'll get you that bill number in just a second as well. The carried interest, right now there are investors that make billions of dollars on their investment and they don't have to pay a tax on it. That's the simplest way I can put it. If we were to tax and close that loophole, we're talking $500 million, and that's a conservative estimate. So there's a carried interest. And then there's also like putting an end to the charter school's ability to expand. I think Cassie touched on that as well. The Charter School Commission, which allows operators to circumvent the local school district's decision, ultimately moving a charter school in the district, even if the district rejects it. These are all pieces of legislation that we're moving now that people can participate in. Here's what I'm going to offer in closing. This moment doesn't call for, in no disrespect to those who have like the intellectual prowess to engage for 3 hours. It really calls for like real bold, transformational activities that push us outside of our comfort zone. What does that mean? It starts with having a conversation. Many of you raised your hand, you're studying education. I'm glad the professor set you straight. You're not a savior. Take a deep breath. You're no one's hero. You're not magical. Let me tell you that now. Somebody said, what's the best thing you can do as a black man teaching in the inner city? Because don't they need to see more black men teachers? I said, no. They need to see more black men working. Whether I'm a teacher or whether I'm driving a CTA train or bus, me working does a lot more for black students than just me sitting in the classroom. Let that one sink in a little bit. It's about the job, it's about work, it's about investment. And so many of the things that we're pushing in this moment have to speak to changing the social dynamics of communities. It's why the CTU doesn't just simply say the schools our children deserve. We're talking about a just Chicago, 30% unemployment. When America had 30% unemployment, at the height of essentially the Great Depression, government was expanded. They literally began to give white men shovels before there was something to dig. And so now you have a neoliberal thought that wants to close and consolidate and make government smaller. It's racist. They only want to make stuff smaller when it starts to benefit people like me. You want to get more involved, it's not just simply calling your legislator. That's a good start, as my mother would say after we would clean the house all day and come downstairs. It's a good start. It's 1 o'clock now. But what we have to do next is, if you really want to understand what is needed in this moment, you have to visit the very neighborhoods in which you say you want to service. Where I live in Austin, on the west side of Chicago, it's the largest city inside of Chicago. So 100,000 people live inside of Austin. That's the size of Springfield, places like Rockford, right? And not a fully functioning neighborhood school. You have a green line, a blue line, you have North Avenue bus, Chicago Avenue bus, you have all of this transportation, but yet you have 30% unemployment and higher depending on your age bracket. So it's not just simply pushing for legislation that increases revenue, the carried interest, the millionaire's tax, progressive tax, elected representative school board. Call your senators, call your state reps, tell them you support 1774 and all the other bill numbers that we'll run through quickly. But now it's about figuring out how you can get more involved. Join an organization, and I'm going to say it like this. Sign up for a shift. That's 4 hours on the phone. If you don't have 4 hours, if you got 2.5 hours, 2 hours, say I'm going to volunteer with Raise Your Hand and BPNC, the CTU, and we're going to knock on doors of this precinct, and we're going to talk to folks about how they can get more involved. Some of the races that we lost politically that have shifted the moment, I'll close with this. This is my preacher, because you get to close twice. This is my last one. And finally, my brother. This is DePaul, right? I get to do that. In the 37th Ward, my colleague, my mentor teacher, Tara Stamps, ran for alderman in the 37th Ward. She ran in a ward that she did not vote in 4 years prior because she lived somewhere else. She came within 500 votes. All I kept thinking was, man, if we just had 5 more people. We're talking 3, 4, 5, 6 votes a precinct. I mean, we had the opportunity to take out one of the most deeply entrenched, political, established, rubber stamp alderman who's been there since 1995, a sister who was teaching 5th and 4th grade science and math and reading, came within 500 votes. Tim Megan, 33rd Ward, the deep history there with the Male family controlling politics in this particular side of town and in Chicago, came within a handful of votes of forcing a runoff with Male's daughter. Sue Garza, who we elected the first time in the CTU's history, electing a teacher to the city council, beat a deeply entrenched Democratic establishment with tremendous racist history over on the southeast side of Chicago. We did that, you all. Chewy Garcia, no disrespect, no one knew his name a year and a half ago. We pulled that brother out like he was an old record player, just dusted him off, threw a suit on him, God bless him. Forced the first runoff in the history of Chicago. You are a part of a movement, whether you believe it or not. So we're saying get involved, force and push these legislators to support the progressive legislation. But I need you all to sign up tonight. Diane does a wonderful job organizing you all. Sign up for a shift. We need 4 hours on doors, 4 hours on the phone. We need to take a day in Springfield. Wendy goes, Cassie goes, I go, people go. We need you in Springfield. We need you at City Hall. There is no nice, polite, intellectual conversation that you can have with these people to get them to do right by black and brown and poor people. The only way you do it is by force. I hope that's been helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. Diane asked if I would just offer a few quick thoughts, and I will. I'll be very quick. But wow, that was amazing. Thank you to our panelists, and I wish I had heard you first because that might have changed my thinking. So really quickly, you know, what I'm so appreciating is how all of our speakers were speaking to movement building. And I'm hearing things around policy analysis, around public awareness, and around policy advocacy. So just really briefly, you know, when Brandon is talking about CTU, I'm so appreciative of the ability to link the policy and micro struggles with a larger kind of policy macro analysis. And in particular, what I'm really appreciating, and thank you for the reminder or the insight about kind of labor work in the 60s and 70s. And it also kind of reminds me of, you know, one of the powers of the CTU, particularly when CORE kind of, you know, got elected into office and was able to lead this really popular and well-supported strike, was we saw a return to different kinds of labor strategies, right? Like labor actually operated differently in the early sort of first part and middle part of the 20th century. Much more consciousness raising, much more grassroots organizing. And in the later part of the 20th century, what we look at in analyses of labor was much more of a compromised approach, right? Compromising with policymakers rather than approaching work as kind of grassroots organizing. And I think if grassroots organizing is centered on policy analysis and kind of connecting the dots, we're able to make some really amazing transformation. I listened to Cheryl and so appreciated with Brighton Park Neighborhood Council the focus on public awareness, both awareness of macro issues, but also awareness of kind of micro. The Know Your Rights campaigns is so vital. It kind of makes me think about, it's not exactly the same, but I'm reminded of in the civil rights movement, freedom schools, right? Happening in church basements and people's garages and, you know, in public spaces that were really all about awareness raising in both senses of the word. It was about kind of linking or connecting the dots around the macro issues, the kind of political systems, but it's also around rights. It's also about what we as individuals can and need to be doing in this larger struggle. And that gets to Cassie with Raise Your Hand and policy advocacy work. I love the reminder that we need to be engaged community members. We all have a role to play, and I'm particularly, those of you who are teachers, I'm particularly swayed by the idea that we need to be reframing what it means to be an educator. You know, when I was learning to be a teacher, so much of us were like, what's the goal? The goal is to shut the classroom door and be brilliant in the classroom. And yeah, isn't that a great goal? It's a great goal, particularly if there's horrible reforms going on all around outside of the classroom. But we need to remind ourselves that teachers, educators, public school employees, we need to be seeing ourselves as part of the classroom, as part of larger social movements. Our work is not only within the classroom, it's also in the form of public engagement. And so here's my last point, since we're in a university setting. One of my favorite lectures that I heard was from the late Eric Rofes, who once began his lecture by saying, in academia, we are such an assimilationist profession. It's not just that we are highly privileged, which we are. It's also that we're in a profession that most values speaking to ourselves. Right? How do you get hired and tenured in higher ed? You write in journals that are read by other higher ed people, often in language that most of us can't understand. So his point is we need to reframe what it means to be an academic so that we're leveraging our resources and our expertise to have material and public impact. Right? We need to bring all that we're doing here in the university to bear on our work. And I think that applies to higher ed. I think that applies to K-12 as well. Let's reframe what it means to do our work. Let's be much more engaged in that process. And then let's be much more hopeful about the changes that we can make happen when we are collective, when we are vision-oriented, and when we are public-focused. So thanks so much, everyone.
Give another strong round of applause.